Good morning, everyone. That's all right, you don't have to respond. Just checking you're still here. Congratulations on coming out on a lovely, wet Sydney day. Congratulations on sitting so close to each other. If you're feeling uncomfortable with that, you can't hear at the back. We'll pay attention to that. I want to start by saying thank you to everyone who helped this to happen. Thank you to everyone from Voices of Wentworth who encouraged us to go ahead with it. Thank you to all the candidates for showing up. I know you're excited that they're all here. Is that right? And can I say, I've conversed with each of the candidates, some at length, some shorter, and I'm really feel privileged that these people who care about Wentworth are all here to speak to you and answer your concerns, because it's important that your voice is heard. I want to welcome you to St. George's. St. George's has a long history of standing for justice and for equity, and we continue to stand. Our brand is a little bit in process. We're an Anglican church, but we have a really strong policy towards women in leadership and towards accepting of diverse gender identities. And we love being here in Paddington and loving the people of Paddington. So this event is an expression of our love for you and our desire to serve you. So if you think of anything, anytime that we can do to help serve our neighbours, we would love to hear it, because we want to show what Jesus' love means to us, to you. Part of that love is providing a toilet. If you go out the door and turn left, the middle door is the toilet. If the door is locked or it looks like a kitchen, it's not a toilet. So please don't go in there. There's 2 stalls, neither are gender identified, so you can choose whichever one you like. Just don't use one that's already being used, please. I'd like to acknowledge that we stand on Gadigal country. And for those who are joining us on Facebook Live, I invite you to name the country that you're standing on at the moment. We recognise that the Gadigal people of the Eora Nations have been the custodians of these lands for millennia before the invasion by European people, that they know this land and we need to learn from them. We know that they know the land as being the subterranean land, the land that we see, and the land that continues up into the sky, that it embraces the sea and all of the creatures that exist above and below the soil and around the territory. And we commit to learning from them, to understanding what it means to be on country, and to learning how to be in relationship with the land. Let me pray. Lord God, I thank you for the people of Paddington and for the people who are offering to stand for us in a national forum. We pray that you would be with us today, that we would hear your voice, that you would speak through one another, and you would help us to hear people of dissenting voices so we might learn from each other. Amen. I'd like to now thank Matt Wade from the Sydney Morning Herald. Any feedback is good feedback, right? I'd like to thank Matt. Economics writer. Thanks, Matt, for joining us today as the moderator. I'm going to hand over to Matt to introduce the candidates. Before I do, I just want to clarify that this is a meet the candidates and ask the questions time. This is not a time to argue science or to argue policies, but rather for you to hear from the candidates what their policies are. Whether they're right or wrong, they're their policies. And I encourage you to listen carefully so that other people can hear and understand so that their vote is intelligent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming. Great to be here, and thank you to St. George's Church for holding this event. I'd just like to reiterate what was just said, and that is the purpose of this event is very clear. It's for voters in Wentworth to ask questions of their candidates and for candidates to respond. That's all we're doing. So let's keep it to that. Let's keep questions brief and responses brief. I'm going to start with all the candidates are going to make a brief statement, and to decide what order that takes, we're going to hand out a number.
Wow.
Oh yeah, well, I'll pick his on his behalf. 3, the candidate coming in from elsewhere. So basically, this is the order that we'll make the statements, and the candidates have 3 minutes. So starting with you, number 1, introduce yourself and tell us why you're standing.
Thanks very much. Oh, thanks very much, Matt. I'm David Shoebridge, the Greens candidate for the Senate in New South Wales, and I'm standing here because our Greens candidate for Wentworth, Dominic Wykenak, is dealing with sorry business, as far too many First Nations peoples deal with in this country. But I'd like to first of all acknowledge we're gathering together on Gadigal land. As a Greens MP, I think I've had a track record, I hope, of the last 11 years walking together with First Nations peoples, and my party is deeply committed to social and environmental justice. And for me, when it comes to social and environmental justice, that starts with First Nations justice. So we're gathered together on Gadigal land. This land always was and always will be First Nations land, and we hopefully live that politics as a party. This is a critical election for us. It's a critical election for the planet. We have a very narrow timeframe in which to deal with what is an impending climate catastrophe. And as somebody who's read the science and a party that politics follows the science, to watch climate change be a non-issue between the Labor Party and the Coalition as we come into this party, both of them with dangerously reckless approaches to climate, indeed both of them supporting the opening or expansion of 114 new coal and gas projects right at the time that we know we have to start drawing down carbon. I find this is perhaps one of the most reckless political campaigns we've seen. So our party is proud to present a comprehensive package to deal with climate, to deal with fairness, and to keep coal and gas in the ground. Because if you have a politician stand up here and say they care about climate, but they want to open the Beetaloo gas basin and use our public money to do that, millions and millions of dollars of public money, and that's the joint position of Labor and the Coalition, and then they say that they actually care about climate, you can't do those two things together. You can't expand coal and gas. You can't continue to have Australia the 3rd largest carbon exporter on the planet, behind just Russia and Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's not a pedestal we want to stand on, is it? So we have a very short window of opportunity to address this. And we need to vote like the future matters. And we need to do politics like the future matters. So our package not only will see us get to 100% renewables by 2030, which is super achievable, but it'll see us get to net zero by 2035. It'll see us ramping down the export thermal coal industry and ending it by 2030, and using that window to obtain the funds we need with an export levy on that coal, on those coal exports, to build the new industries that we need, to build the exciting future of offshore wind that pumps into our industrial heartlands in Newcastle and Wollongong, to build and invest in green steel, to actually be part of the solution. So that's why we're running in this election, to actually be a voice for the future, a voice for the science, and I think a voice for our collective well-being. We have a very short window to act, and it starts on 21 May.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Jimmer, and I'm a dentist of 27 years. It's nice to be inside a church that I used to always eat lunch at in the courtyard. I have walked through the streets of Paddington and many other suburbs and seen the empty shops, the legacy of the Liberal and Labor lockdowns. The mental health issues and suicides were and still are greatly increased, not to mention the financial disaster by our government. We have now accrued a whopping $1.3 trillion in debt. We need to pay this back. We cannot leave this as a legacy for our children and our grandchildren to come, and maybe even their children. It is the UAP's policy to pay back our debt using a 15% tariff on iron ore and bring the processing back to our country. This will be paid back at a fraction of the predicted timeframe. By using this tariff, the UAP will get rid of HECS debt and HECS payments so that the youth of today do not enter the workforce with a huge debt. This is a policy which will enable the young to fulfill the great Aussie dream of owning their own home. The UAP will also bring $1 trillion of super back to Australian shores to invest into Australian companies and promote Australian jobs for Australian people. The United Australian Party will scrap the provisional tax and allow those small businesses who are big pillars of our society to have the ability to pay tax only once a year after they had the chance to be profitable. Many small businesses and their owners have expressed that if there is another lockdown, they will close their doors permanently. Australia's inflation has just hit 5.1%. The interest rate hikes are inevitable and predictable. Can you all afford a 2 to 4% interest rate hike with your mortgages and your home ownerships? Our policies will ensure that the difficult times ahead are weathered by the people of Wentworth without great loss of homes by fixing existing home loans at 3% for 5 years. And before you say it can't be done, it's been done previously. Now, I'm not a career politician, as you may have noticed. Like a lot of people up here, I've never had family in politics either. What I am is an Australian patriot who loves her country. Australia has given my family so many opportunities for an incredible life. And I'd like to see a government which has solution-based policies, not empty promises. Wentworth is the second highest tax paying electorate. So you guys are paying the second highest tax in Australia. We deserve the right to know where our money goes and what the politicians who are working for us are doing with it. I have been a resident of Wentworth electorate since the late 70s when my family came here from the Ukraine. I landed here in 78. And I promise you that I will do all that is in my power, if elected, to enrich and improve this community and its residents.
Number 3 on the hymn number is coming to us via the television. Daniel from the LDP.
Good morning. Can everybody see and hear me okay? I didn't hear loud applause, but I did get a thumbs up. Thank you, Allegra. Well, my name's Daniel Lukovic. I'm from the Liberal Democrats. I join you this morning from Perth, where it's either 3 hours behind Sydney or 15 years, depending who you ask. But thank you for having me there. As a good Jewish boy, can I start by saying this is probably the longest amount of time I've spent inside a church, and I'm actually quite grateful for the invitation to speak to everyone. Like Natalie, I'm not a career politician. I'm a business owner. I own a successful business. It started as a small business from scratch and it grew, and I spend my day protecting Australians' life and safety. That's what I do. That's what my people do. And I've sat and watched in despair over many years as career politicians who've never run a business, who've never owned a business, who've never worked in a business, have been telling the rest of us what to do with our lives, what to do with our business, where we can go, where we can't go, who we can speak to, who we can have as customers, and taxing us so that they can go and spend money on vanity projects and things that don't advance this nation. Now, Australia being a wonderful country, that's something that we all tended to put up with. But the last few years have really galvanized my thoughts on this, because I've watched as people who have done nothing wrong have had their lives essentially torn apart or ruined by people who have lost Nothing. And that's not good enough. Now, we talk about Wentworth, but there's a big country out there that goes well beyond Wentworth. And it's one thing to say you care and to virtue signal, but it's another thing to actually put that into practice. Outside my hotel in Perth, there are three blackfellas who were on the driveway when I arrived, and I actually had a chat to them. And there's a lot of Indigenous homelessness around the towns in Perth, and there's a lot of white homelessness as well. And I was talking to those people, and I can guarantee you, when you talk to someone in that situation and you ask them, what are the biggest concerns you have at the moment? They're not going to tell you a federal ICAC or climate change. But if you spoke to certain people in Wentworth, you'd be convinced that that is the only thing that seems to be on people's agenda. I don't think that's right. I think there are people who have spent the pandemic sitting at home, and the hardest suffering they had was posting tweets telling people to stay safe. They lost nothing. They come from money. The biggest drama might be the cost of foie gras going up. We have to look beyond that. We have to look at helping Australia. We have to look at taking this country forward. And the way to do that is by putting in policies, especially regarding energy, that's actually going to keep costs down, make life livable for ordinary Australians. The Liberal Democrats is a party that's committed to freedom. It's committed to less government. It's committed to lower taxes. We've got a suite of lovely policies that I'd be keen to talk to you about. And while we're talking about renewables and so forth, as a business owner, I'm interested in things that work. I'm not interested in things that are going to make a whole lot of money for billionaires that's going to essentially become a tax on the poor. So I'd also like to talk about nuclear energy, and I'd like to talk about things that are going to advance this nation, make it easier for business, make it easier for citizens, and make it easier not only for the people in Wentworth, but the people in greater Australia as well. Thank you.
He was under time, isn't that good? Number 4, Tim.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Gadigal and Bidjigal people, and their elders past and present. This morning I was at an event for the Mile Creek Massacre Memorial, and that was a reminder to me that as a nation, we still have not done enough to recognise our First Nations people, and it'd be lovely to have their voice in our parliament. I'd also like to thank John for putting this event on, and everybody for turning up here today. It's great to see such a good crowd. Can you hear me down the back? Great. So this is my 3rd time running in this electorate. I'm very clear that the people of Wentworth want action on climate change. For more than a decade, the politics of climate change in our country has been swinging like a pendulum. The Labor Party gets in and tries to do things like an emission trading scheme and a carbon tax. The Liberals come in and tell us that electric vehicles are going to ruin tradies' weekends. It's actually more like a wrecking ball in our economy and in our society, and we need to stop that. And I believe the Labor Party can bring the nation together, as we've done in the past, where we can create climate action as a political good that can never be taken away from all Australians. We did that with Medicare, we did it with free education, and we will do it with climate action. Some of the key policies of the Labor Party in this area is spending $20 billion to upgrade the power grid. It's a rather boring and dull policy that won't get anybody excited, but it's necessary for all the alternative energy coming into the grid. The market won't solve that problem, and that's where government has to step up to make sure that we can get the alternative energy we need. My parents were hippies, and I grew up tinkering with solar panels, wind turbines, and arrays of batteries. And I'm very aware that the technology we need to make the changes are already available. All we need to do is get out of the way and help people to get it done. In my first 2 campaigns, when I understood there was a paradox in Wentworth that we have the lowest solar uptake in the country, or nearly the lowest solar uptake in the country. And yet people are so passionate about climate change. The big issue there is that to get solar onto apartment buildings, where 60% of the people in Wentworth live, is quite a complex and difficult task. I've got a team of people together to solve that problem. I believe we have a solution now, and I joined Waverley Council and was voted in to get that done. And my first act as a Waverley councillor was to move a motion to start to see that happen. We will put in more electric vehicle charging stations. I was with Chris Bowen on Thursday, and he said he will give a community battery, one of the 400 that Labor is providing, to Bondi. So I look forward to working with you all on solving climate action, whether I win this election or not. Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for coming today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we meet and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm Allegra Spender, and I'm standing as an independent candidate for Wentworth. I'm a CEO, I'm a renewable energy advocate, and I'm a mum. I've lived in Wentworth almost my entire life, and I've run businesses for the last 12 years. I decided to run because I'm fed up with what's going on in Canberra. I'm fed up with the lack of action on climate change. I'm fed up with the lack of integrity in politics. I'm fed up with the treatment of women in our parliament and in our country. For a long time, Wentworth has been a safe Liberal seat, but Wentworth won't be taken for granted anymore. We've tried electing MPs to be part of a government, but this hasn't delivered a government that reflects the values of this community. Instead, we're left with Scott Morrison and Barnaby Joyce's representative in Wentworth, not our representative in Canberra. A strong independent can turn that around. Independents have already done that in Warringah, Mayo, and Indi. They've gone to Canberra and they've made differences for their community on issues such as education or water management. This electorate has seen the difference that Karen Phelps made. You know, in less than 1 year in Canberra, she passed legislation that got critically ill asylum seekers and refugees off Nauru and Manus. Our local representative voted against that and repealed that law almost as soon as he joined Parliament. I've lived here in Wentworth my whole life, so I know this community well. During the campaign, I've spoken to so many people around here and have been really talking about what are the values of this community. And this is best summed up by Sean, who's a guy I met in Bondi. And he said, look, climate change is important to me. I want to have an environment I can pass to my kids. He said, I value kindness and decency in my society. I value those and I want to see that. And he said, and I'm a business owner, and so I need a strong economy and a strong environment for business. And I'm 100% behind those values. If I'm elected, my priorities will be strong action on climate change because this is an environmental imperative to act. It gives us a $1 trillion economic opportunity and also can address cost of living pressures that we are facing right now. I'll be driving integrity, transparency, and accountability in politics, such as a strong National Integrity Commission. And I will drive a future-focused and inclusive economy that supports business, innovation, and women. And finally, and unabashedly, look at our policies through the lens of kindness and decency. This is the community platform. This is what our community asks for. And I will be consulting the community and consulting experts for every single thing that I do. In Wentworth, we have 6 or 7 candidates, but only 2 who can actually win this election. So you can either choose the Liberal Party's representative in Wentworth, 3 more years of inaction in climate change, 3 more years broken promises on integrity, 3 more years of votes for Scott Morrison and Barnaby Joyce, whatever their agenda. Or you can choose an independent who will champion the issues that matter to you most, who will listen to you and get things done in Canberra, an independent that can truly create a better climate for Wentworth. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, St George's, for hosting us here today. I also wanted to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting today, the Gadigal and Bidjigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm Dave Sharma. I've been your local MP here for the last 3 years, and prior to that, I was a career diplomat representing Australia overseas in places like Israel, Papua New Guinea, and Washington, DC. This election is a very pivotal election. It's taking place at a time of great global uncertainty. We've seen Russia's aggression against Ukraine not only lead to terrible humanitarian consequences and economic disruption, but it's also challenging the very basis of the global order that has underpinned Australia's security and prosperity for the past 70 years. We've also seen overseas the ongoing effects of the COVID pandemic, supply chain disruptions, and global economic uncertainty and geopolitical tensions see a return of inflationary pressures and higher degree of economic uncertainty. Now, Australia as a country has come through the pandemic very strongly. We've got one of the highest vaccination rates of any country in the world. We've saved tens of thousands of lives compared to comparable countries around the world. Our economy is larger than it was before the pandemic, and we've got more people in jobs now than we did before the pandemic. But there are many challenges ahead. And I'm unashamedly putting myself forward as part of a government team, as part of a voice in the room where decisions are made, as someone who will have a seat at the decision-making table, and as part of a government and a team that has a plan to safeguard our economy, to strengthen our security, to address things like cost of living pressures on families, to invest more money in the basic social services we all rely upon, and to continue to invest in low emissions technologies that will accelerate our transition to a net zero future. I think I've shown in the last 3 years that I'm a representative of the Liberal Party here in Wentworth, but I will also always act as a strong local voice for our community, that I'll act with principle and integrity, that I'll do what I say I'm going to do, and that I'll continue to protect and seek to enhance our quality of life here in Wentworth. Thank you.
Yeah.
Really hear unless people speak
Oh, okay.
clearly into the mic.
So that's the message. We need to speak clearly and loudly into the mic. Thank you. Look, it's now time for questions. There's a few different ways that people have been able to ask questions prior to the event. We're going to start with some of them, and I'm going to group them around some key policy issues. And then after we've had a bit of a period of that, we'll then turn to questions from the audience. So we've got a very interesting question, one that's close to my heart from one of the a constituent, and it simply is, what is your vision of the new economy? And I guess I'd sort of add my commentary to that to say, how will things be different under a platform that you were promoting in Parliament compared to the way the economy has worked in the past? Maybe we'll go the reverse order to what we did before. So Dave, you want to start?
Sure. Look, I think clearly the nature of value creation in an economy is changing. And I think this is an immensely promising thing for a country like Australia, and a country with the level of education and skills that Australia has had. Before I got into Parliament, I was the Australian ambassador to Israel, where I worked with a number of technology companies and startups and entrepreneurs, Australians as well as Israelis. And before I came into Parliament, I was the chair of a technology company that's publicly listed on the ASX. I'm a big believer that Australia needs to be making sure we have a more technology-rich economy, because these are the jobs of the future. If you look at what were the biggest companies on the US stock exchange, the Dow Jones index 50 or 60 years ago, there were companies like Standard Oil and Kodak, General Motors, AT&T. Nearly all of these companies are gone now or have been radically transformed or no longer do business. And these days it's the technology companies. It's your Facebooks, it's your Alphabets, it's your Amazons, your Netflix, your Googles, all those companies, because that's where the new jobs and the new wealth is being created. The great thing about these jobs is the tyranny of distance, which is something that Australia has historically struggled with, no longer matters so much in the data-rich world. But also it means that people who have high skills, high education, strong rule of law, countries like that can benefit immensely from it. And the other big great advantage about this, of course, is that it will lessen our dependence upon fossil fuels and heavy resources as an economy. So we're investing as a government and a country in things like reforms in the cryptocurrency area to make sure we can establish a cryptocurrency sector here that is safe for consumers, but it also recognises that this will be a medium of value in the future, into modern manufacturing initiatives in areas like clean technology and digital health, and then making sure we get the regulatory and policy settings right for new financial products and services, fintech companies, green tech companies and things like that. Because if we want to remain a high living standard, high wage economy in Australia, we need to be capturing these jobs of the future.
I think about it kind of, the economic future of this country in three ways. And I firstly is about using our government spending and frankly, our taxpayer money to what is the most impactful for the community and what's most important for the community. But then it's about unlocking the innovation and potential of this economy. And it's finally making sure that this is an inclusive new economy where all Australians can thrive. So firstly, in terms of accountable spending, it's about saying how to make sure that we use, the billions of dollars that we spend across the economy for what adds most values, not just what retains marginal seats. And so I'd be starting with saying, how do we cut $10 billion worth of subsidies to fossil fuels? But then you go to what can actually drive this economy future. And I look at things like, firstly, we've had low productivity and we've had low wage growth, and we know that. And that is about addressing those fundamental issues about how do we get the right skills in there. And I've spent the last 4 years running a network of low socioeconomic schools and businesses addressing just this. What are the skills that our kids need for the future, and how to make sure that all young people have those skills? And so that is about technology. It is about climate, but it's also about, how do we address red tape for business, because that holds us back from our productivity. And it is also about saying, what is our tax system doing in terms of actually driving business growth? These are really important issues. But finally, I think it's also about the people. And it's like, how do you make this an inclusive economy? And I come back again to the kids that I worked with, who don't start who start 3 years behind, to be honest, in maths and science compared to other kids in more privileged areas like Wentworth. And I think that if we invest in education and ensure that those kids have the best start of life, that is better for our economy. If you can invest in women and childcare, and also about parental leave so that more women are actually involved in the economy for longer, that is better for our economy. And if you can also invest in older people to ensure that older people can work in this country for longer without the sort of loss of their pensions, these are things that are actually better for our economy. So this is about making it's an inclusive economy, an innovative economy, an economy that doesn't waste our money. Thank you.
I'm very excited about our future. What we need to do is we need to rapidly transform to alternative energy. We need to electrify everything, and we need to move from being an exporter of fossil fuels to being an exporter of alternative energy. We have an abundant amount of wind and solar power, and we can turn that into energy that we can export just as we currently export fossil fuels. And that is the hope of the Labor Party, that we can transform our society in that way. Behind that, we have an education program, and there will be 10,000 new TAFE opportunities for people to rewire the nation and to fix your electric car when you need to get it repaired. We also have a $3 billion fund to invest in the technology necessary to transform our economy. If we want to make steel from hydrogen, that comes at a cost, and we need to invest in that. We also need to make sure that it's a fairer economy and that more women are participating, and better childcare subsidies is the way that we'll be doing that. Labor has the best childcare subsidies of the two major parties. Thank you very much.
Now we'll go to Daniel.
Thank you for that. One of the things that strikes you when you come to Perth is that there's a handful of skyscrapers in the CBD. And whereas in Sydney, skyscrapers have names like Cisco or Microsoft or IBM on them, when you come here, there's a skyscraper that has BHP on top and another skyscraper that has Rio Tinto on it. And there's this tiny little building next to it, PricewaterhouseCoopers. So the accountants have the small building and the mining industries have the big thing. And it really drives home the contribution that revenue actually makes to this nation. Now, as a business owner, as someone who started a business, I understand the difference between slogans, between mission and vision statements, and things that actually work. And what I've listened to so far is a whole lot of sloganeering and a whole lot of platitudes. But what we're basically doing is we're selling the family farm. We're investing in and betting on things that aren't going to work. And it's going to result not only in a lot of Australians basically becoming poorer and sitting in darkness, but it's going to make billions and billions of dollars for people who maybe they're not making it on coal, so they want to make it on renewables. And that's a problem for me, because what I hear about this is we're going to put in batteries, we're going to put in a community battery. Well, the chemicals inside that battery, the metals inside that battery, cobalt, is mined by 6-year-old children in Central Africa. Now, it's really easy to turn a blind eye to that, but every single person in that room is going to say, oh, we really care about things, doesn't seem to care about that. And yes, it's fine to say, well, we have an abundance of wind and solar, except we don't when the wind's not blowing, and we don't when the sun is not shining. So you need to put in batteries. Now, batteries don't produce energy. They only store energy that came from somewhere else. One of the other things I want to address is this myth that you hear of fossil subsidies, or that the government or the taxpayer is subsidizing those industries. Let me tell you something. Those industries are subsidizing the rest of this country. The amount of revenue that's produced from our mining exports dwarfs everything else. Now, let me just make one thing very clear. I am not bankrolled by billionaires. I don't report to them. I don't owe them anything. So I have no conflict here in saying things that I think will work and things that I won't work. And that's not something that some of the other candidates can say honestly. But we need to look at things that are actually going to work. And everything I've heard so far, for example, we're going to have subsidies. Well, where does that money for subsidies comes from? It comes from revenue. And if we're taking a prime revenue source and we're turning that off and we're replacing with something that has not been proven to work anywhere in the world, and we seem to have the arrogance and the entitlement to think that we're going to pull it off here, that sounds to me like a great con job that's going to make some people billions of dollars, but it's going to be a tax on the poor.
Thanks,
and it's
Daniel.
not going
Thanks,
to work.
Daniel. I'll have to cut you off there. Time's up. Next response from Natalie.
Hi. I sort of agree with Daniel in a way in that the renewables need to be looked at really carefully. I've got one more thing to add. Not only, I mean, I have a child, I'm a mother, and cobalt is horrendously mined in the Congo by 6-year-olds. And I'm sorry about you guys. I would never want my child anywhere near a mine. It is like blood batteries, not blood diamonds anymore. But let's get back to economy. We need to bring manufacture back to our shores. We have offshored so many things. We used to have manufacturing of cars. We used to have so many different manufacturers, and it's not happening anymore. So we are looking at, in the UAP, to bring back the 15% tariff on the iron ore and manufacture it here so that we can provide the money to pay off that debt that we've created over this entire pandemic. We need to do so many things about our education. I agree with Allegra. Our education system, we are considered something, I don't even remember the number, but we're behind Kazakhstan. The only way we can improve this economy is get education into our children, create them into these beings that care about our society and will work for our society. Yes, we need to invest into technology as well, but the manufacture of things will bring things back into our country. We need money in our country because all the things that we are talking about need funding. How are we going to pay for all this? We need the funding. And that's the only way I see moving forward.
When we look forward to the next three years, we look forward to a really exciting future for the country. But it starts with putting integrity in politics. So in the first few weeks of the next parliament, let's have a National Integrity Commission with full retrospective powers so that the parliament, and let's get corporate donations out of politics so that the parliament actually acts in the long-term interests of all of us and our economic future, not just the corporates that buy the big parties. That's really critical for the next 3 years. But let's also not invest in the technologies of the 20th and 19th century, because that's where a whole lot of public money is being put by the coalition and by Labor. They want to spend $600 million of public money building a gas-fired power station in Kurri Kurri, our money, a gas-fired power station that will be turned on at best 2% of the time. And they pretend they're good economic managers. I mean, that's just a criminal misuse of our public money. Instead, let's invest in those new jobs. We have an extraordinary potential here to become a green energy superpower and to be saying to countries like Germany, you want to get off Russian gas? Hey, have we got some green hydrogen and investment opportunities for you here in Australia? That would be an amazing conversation. But could you imagine sending Scott Morrison over to do that? I mean, it's just a laughable prospect. It is a genuinely laughable prospect. But we also want to see a fairer Australia. We want to see dental put into Medicare, because I don't know if you've noticed, but increasingly that people's teeth are an indication of class and wealth in this country. And we cannot work out why Medicare stops at your teeth. And we have a fully costed plan to extend Medicare into dental. And that's an exciting future. The last time the Greens were in the balance of power in 2010, we extended dental into kids Medicare, to provide dental services for kids. And since then, 3 million children have had their teeth fixed. Imagine if we were thinking of those kinds of social policies, those kinds of economic policies. Imagine where we could be in 3 years' time.
Thank you. Now, I gave everyone 2 minutes for that response, but I'm going to cut it down to 1 minute for the next one, okay? And this is a foreign policy question submitted by a constituent, and it is, how does each candidate see Australia's position in the Pacific, and how do we refocus our relationships with our neighbours, both in the Pacific Islands and Indonesia? We'll go the reverse order again. So
just about 6 weeks ago, I had an online Zoom session with Anatay Tong, the former president of Kiribati. And he's an extremely brave person. And he went into the UN repeatedly and said, if you care about the Pacific, if you care about the future of our actual countries and culture, you've got to deal with climate. So unless Australia is willing to keep the coal in the ground, stop Newcastle being the largest single coal export, when we go into the Pacific, they look at us like a vandal, like a neighbor who's a vandal who wants to destroy their future. And it has been an appalling lack of attention to the South Pacific that we've seen, and the Pacific that we've seen under the coalition government. So it starts with climate, but then it starts with issues like extending our foreign aid to 0.7% of GDP and actually investing in those countries and being a good neighbor. And if you really are concerned about future insecurity in this country, look at what climate change will do to Indonesia and the instability in Indonesia. That is a frightening prospect. And the best way for regional security is addressing climate change, being a good neighbor, increasing our aid.
We do need to address climate change, and we need to be amazing neighbours to all our Pacific neighbours. But I think with climate change, how are we going to address this if we're continually looking at solar panels and windmills and not looking at anything that will supplement that? And the fact that a lot of them are actually being manufactured in China and not here. So again, why can't we help our neighbours by starting manufacture in Australia? Yes, absolutely look at it, but look at the manufacturing back here and help them through our own manufacture, not foreign manufacture. We've got now China signing deals in the Solomon Islands. Now we need to get our defence up as well. We've got them buying up land in the Pilbara, and they have a 99-year lease up in Darwin, Port of Darwin, Newcastle. How are we going to look at the defence as well in our nation? We're not looking at that at all. So we've got a lot of work to do in this country.
Look, as someone who studied risk and security for many years, I know a shakedown and a con artist when I see it. When you look at some of these Pacific Island countries that are basically coming to us for money and saying, oh, we need the money because of climate change. If you're silly enough to believe that, you shouldn't be lecturing anybody on economic management. It's no real surprise to me why China has effectively endorsed the Greens. It seems to be very cozy with Labor precisely because of these policies. We have a national defence challenge, which is very simply this. If we, God forbid, went to war with China tomorrow, the first thing we'd have to do is ask them to manufacture all the ammunition for us. We have no resilience, we have no self-reliability or capability, and that's a problem. Now, there is a huge opportunity in the South Pacific for us to actually create new third world manufacturing and bring them into the first world and use those cheap resources rather than just paying sit-down money to them. But also the suggestion that we make any meaningful impact on climate change. The reality is that if Australia shut down tomorrow, there were no lights, there was no electricity, there were no cars, there was nothing, our total impact would be such a rounding error on a global scale that why we would ruin the things that we have to do that, to me, is insane.
Look, the Pacific is incredibly important to Australia, so from a cultural point of view, but absolutely, and from a foreign policy point of view, but also from a defence point of view. And I think that, our current situation with the Solomon Islands is really concerning, and it should be concerning to all of us. So I think what we should be doing in the Pacific is returning to some of the things that we have done in the past, which is using our full suite of tools in front of us, diplomatic as well as defense and security and aid, to build and strengthen those relationships. So that is absolutely working with the Pacific on climate change, because it is an existential threat to those communities. It is returning to things like the ABC in the Pacific, which is a wonderful soft power tool that we use and then we have abandoned. It's restored. Thank you. It's about restoring, the level of support we gave to the Pacific in the past, and really working with them as partners. And it's absolutely improving our diplomacy, because I think, in the Pacific, but also in relation to AUKUS, you could see that where false steps in diplomacy and actually the gutting of our diplomatic corps has been a real significant issue in Australia's foreign policy. And I'll work with either government on side to make sure that we cover those priorities. Thank you.
The idea of China having a naval base and airfields 2,000 kilometres north of Australia, I think, is the greatest failure of the Morrison government for our security so far. And it comes from a retreat from foreign aid. The Labor Party will address that. They have promised to put $525 million into Pacific aid over the next 4 years. It's also a failure to do our part for climate action, because climate change and a withdrawal of support for those nations has led them to seek other partners, and that other partner is China. China is willing to fill any gap we vacate. We have to move back in, ensure that those nations prosper and maintain our security. Thank you.
Look, I've worked closely with the Pacific in my career as a diplomat. My first overseas assignment was with a peacekeeping force in Bougainville. I was then served in Papua New Guinea for a few years, and I was part of the policy team that put together the regional assistance mission to the Solomon Islands, our first military and peacekeeping or stabilisation presence there. So this is a region that I know closely and I'm familiar with, and that I know is incredibly important to Australia. What events around the world tell us, though, including the establishment of a military agreement between China and Solomon Islands and Russia's war in Ukraine, is that the world around us is changing, and we're going to be facing a more challenging environment. The Solomon Islands deal with China shouldn't be a surprise, and isn't for anyone who's been watching this closely. Yes, it's a very unfortunate development, but it's also a harbinger of things to come. Great power competition is back on the world stage. Our strategic holiday is over, and that's why we need to be stepping up our engagement in our Pacific neighbours, in Indonesia, but also more broadly across the world, because we can no longer rely upon some of the certainties and sureties we have in the past to guarantee our safety and security. We've had a strategic holiday in Australia the last 5 to 6 decades, and that strategic holiday is over now.
Okay, look, this issue is already, we've touched on this very briefly, but there's quite a good and specific question on a federal ICAC that's been submitted that I'll read. How highly does each candidate rank the establishment of a federal integrity body with equivalent powers to the New South Wales ICAC and with guaranteed independence and adequate funding? We'll go the reverse again. Dave, you can start.
I support a Commonwealth Integrity Commission. I don't support one along the New South Wales model. I think the experience of other states has shown the dangers of that model. South Australia, both sides of politics in South Australia recently voted to amend their own model. The Victorian model, the IBAC models as it's called, provides different levels and, in my view, more appropriate levels of protections for people who are accused but for whom no evidence has been found. So I support a Commonwealth Integrity Commission, but I do want to make sure that it doesn't become a forum for the pursuit of political vendettas. And when I look at the experience in New South Wales, we've lost in New South Wales 3 premiers to ICAC, 2 of whom have been found to have done nothing wrong, no adverse findings against them. The 3rd we're still waiting to see. I worry about a system that supplants the choice that voters make and that electors are entitled to make about who governs them with a body that is not accountable directly to the public. So I absolutely support a body that scrutinises the conduct of politicians, scrutinises the spending of public money, but I don't want a body that takes decisions away from the rightful electors here, which is the public of Australia.
ICAC, or federal ICAC, or National Anti-Corruption Commission, as the Labor Party calls it, is something that people of Wentworth rank very highly. It's their #2 priority. Recently, I was at the Bondi Junction railway station. A young guy came up to me, and when I asked him, what's your policy priority, he said a federal ICAC. And I said, oh yeah, sure. So I said, give me some examples of corruption. He rattled off a long list in some detail. So this is not some casual obsession of Wentworth. People deeply care about that. So it's a very high priority. I asked 3 questions about the federal ICAC. One is, would it be independent? Yes. Under Labor, it would be. Would it be well funded? Yes. Would it be the same as New South Wales? I can't tell you. I haven't seen the detail. Just want to be honest with you about that. Thank you.
Daniel?
Oh, sorry, you're all looking at me. Well, look, thank you, everyone. I think integrity is really important. And, you know, look, I can say I'm not owned by anyone. I'm not compromised by anyone. I chuckle at the idea of Labor supporting anti-corruption mechanisms simply because there are so many Labor MPs in New South Wales prisons that they could practically start a branch in there. So the problem that I've found is, look, in business, often it's the companies that virtue signal the loudest that are doing the wrong things when they think no one's looking. And so, you know, banks, for example, on the front window, they have a traditional welcome, bit like this morning, and they have, you know, big gay ATMs out the front. And so they're virtue signaling on that. And meanwhile, they're ripping off mums and dads. And so I think it's a case of, you know, methinks the lady doth protest too much. And some of the people who are demanding more integrity from others, I think people need to be applying a bit of scrutiny there because, you know, when you've got billionaires funding you or when you're making huge sort of hope and change slogans and there's no underpinning policy, I think people need to take a long look at this. And a lot of this is a major distraction exercise from real problems for the nation.
Thanks, Daniel.
I want better government in this country. It's why I'm standing. And for me, a federal ICAC is absolutely integral to that. Is one of the top 2 things that I'm standing for if I'm elected into Wentworth. And I'm in terms of the model that I'm looking for, I want a model that has appropriate powers that can hold politicians to account, that can hold public servants to account, that is independent in its funding and independent in its action, and that uses appropriate judgment in terms of whether something needs to be public or not. I think it's incredibly important that we have private hearings because people need privacy to exist to examine whether it's an issue or not. But once you have that finding, and if you know that this is really of the public interest, then absolutely we need public forums. And I think that a federal ICAC with teeth that really holds people to account, which has retrospective powers and also has a whistleblowing power so that anyone can refer someone to a federal ICAC is absolutely crucial to good government in this country.
I do believe in holding government to account with everything that they are doing. And that is the only reason I'm standing here today. I don't really agree with the way that the pandemic was planned out or how people were treated throughout that particular plan. So yes, these people need to be held accountable to everything that they do. How that is going to occur, I don't know. I don't know how to create it, but I don't want witch hunts either. Because if every single person is allowed to have a federal ICAC or demand a federal ICAC, we will have a witch hunt because somebody might have a vendetta against a politician and then they will go after them. But definitely every single politician needs to be held account, especially when they've been involved with lobbyists who have paid them for certain things. So yeah, let's look at that.
Well, I've been in the New South Wales Parliament for 11 and a half years, and thank God we've got ICAC. That's all I can say. It has been critical. It has been absolutely critical. And any politician who stands up and says the same political parties that are engaging in federal politics don't need a federal ICAC, given what we see at a state level, is actually not telling you the truth. Because actually federally, it's even worse. There are almost no limits on corporate donations. No one will know who's paying the Labor and the Liberal Party for this election until about 6 months after the election. And we fundamentally need layer upon layer upon layer of integrity measures at a national level. It starts with a federal ICAC. Thankfully, the Greens have already had legislation passed through the Senate in this last parliamentary term, and then it got stalled downstairs. That was for a comprehensive national ICAC, full retrospective powers to look at the dodgy grants and deals over the last decade. And also strong whistleblower protections, because we also need to protect the public servants. And I've been in the New South Wales Parliament, and the courage of public servants who are willing to stand up and call it out needs 100% to be supported. So we need strong whistleblower laws, strong ICAC, independently funded with full retrospective powers.
Thank you. Look, I'm going to ask two more questions that have been pre-submitted, and then we'll go to audience questions. This one is a question on asylum seeker issues. The person submitting the question makes a note about how much money has been spent on offshore detention in the past 2 years or 10 years. And their question is, what benefit to Australia has been achieved by spending over 11 billion of our taxpayer dollars in detaining genuine refugees for years on end, some now for 10 years? We'll start with...
Australia's refugee policy is designed under systemic cruelty. It actually offends pretty much every moral principle, where we have a policy which will consciously harm those people and their kids who came here without ever having committed a crime. And if that's the basis upon which we set national policy, it's a stain on the country. And the Greens fundamentally believe we need to reform our refugee laws so that it's not a crime to come here as a refugee. We release those refugees and their kids who have been held in detention. Kids who have been born in Australia have spent their life in detention under a policy of collective cruelty designed by both the Coalition and Labor, and it must end. And when we release refugees, as we've seen some refugees released only in the last few months, when we release them from detention, they need a right to work so that they can have a life of dignity. Because what kind of cruelty releases a refugee from detention, gives them no social security benefits, gives them no Medicare benefits, and then says they can't work? But that's the combined policy of the Coalition and Labor. It must end. We're better than that.
I guess my family was semi-refugees because we came from the Ukraine and were embraced by Australia. So I definitely agree that keeping people for years detained is not ideal. It is definitely a travesty of justice. The United Australia Party does not have a policy on this, but me, myself, and I should say, I don't agree with that at all. But we've got to also look at not just the fact that we've got refugees there, we have to look at all the humanitarian things going on around the world. Yes, we should release these refugees, but we also have to look at the humanitarian aspect of the weaker people in China that no one's looking at, who produce wafers in solar panels. Why aren't we looking at that? There's so many humanitarian problems in the world, and we really need to address them, and address them soon. People are suffering. Thank you.
Me or Danny? Look, the offshore detention has kept people in detention for 9 years indefinitely. These are genuine refugees, and at the same time, it has been a colossal cost to the Australian taxpayer. And both these things must change. I worked for the last 4 years at ABCN, and we worked with a lot of refugee young people. And just this week, I spent an evening listening to actually some of the refugee students that we worked with, talking about their experience and their absolute desire to do the best they possibly can in this country, and the inspiring young people who just want to give back to their community and contribute to this country. That is the future that we can have if we truly look after our refugees and make sure that we do not detain them indefinitely, that we lift the refugee quota, and we stop these temporary protection visas, which puts people's lives on hold, 30,000 people's lives on hold, and these people could be making deep contribution to this country. Thank you.
I think it might be a sign of the coming of the apocalypse that I actually agree with part of what a Greens MP said, and that was in respect to actually allowing people to work when they come to this country. Look, this is complicated. My grandparents came to this country at the conclusion of the Holocaust, and they came here as a refugee, but there is an important point. This was the first place that would accept them, and that's where they went. Now, one of the challenges that we have in international migration is economic migration, and genuine asylum seekers will often go to the first safe place they can go to. However, when people go through multiple countries, you have to be a bit more cynical. It's also noteworthy that whilst I think it's appalling people are kept in detention for 10 years, I think justice needs to be swift to be effective. A lot of that is because of drawn out appeals processes that are dragged on by activist groups and so forth, that mean rather than these things being settled very quickly one way or another, they're dragged out indefinitely. And as long as they know that there's a prize at the end of that, I can guarantee you if there's polls suggesting that a Labor coalition could form the next government, perhaps with a few so-called independents, there are people smugglers overseas who are right now taking bookings. And if we look at unchecked migration in Europe and in America, it's a disaster, and it's not something we want here uncontrolled.
Under Labor, the number of refugees that will be included in our intake will double to 27,000, and we'll have a program for 5,000, an additional 5,000 people to live in the community on the model of the Canadian way of accepting asylum seekers. Labor is not committed to removing offshore processing, but it will be days that people will spend there, not years. And we will work with the UNHCR and others to relocate those refugees to other locations. And in Australia, asylum seekers, refugees will have better visa protection. Thank you.
Look, I support a generous humanitarian intake into Australia. One of the things I worked on very hard last year was after the fall of Kabul, making sure individual Afghan families were issued visas quickly and were able to leave and get transit through Pakistan and other places and back to Australia. I argued for an increase in our refugee intake. It was initially 5,000, an increase to 16,500. Just last month in the budget, we announced an increase to 31,500. I also accept, though, that the necessary complement of a generous humanitarian intake program is confidence of the Australian people in our border policies and the process by which people arrive in Australia. And I think it's incredibly important that we maintain the integrity of that, to maintain public confidence in the integrity of our migrant and refugee intake program. When we came to office in 2013, there were 19 detention centres operating in Australia. We've closed all of them. There were several hundred people in offshore processing centres in Manus and Nauru. We've got that down to small single digits. I feel terrible for the people who've been in that state of uncertainty for that many years, but I think it's important that we maintain a stop against the people smuggling trade, a stop against people losing their lives at sea because people are exploiting and making profit off their misery.
Thank you. We've also got people submitting questions via Facebook, which has been where there's a feed live, and this is one that's come in on that method. And I just ask everyone to just give a very brief response to this. This is able to be answered very briefly. What are the positions of the candidates on Australia as a republic? Isn't it about time we had an Australian head of state? I'm just going to say, I think we'll go to random kind of order this time. So maybe you can start.
I actually don't have a position on that, really. I think that should be another referendum. And I think the people of Australia need to decide that. It has nothing to do with my opinion at all. I think the people here need to decide where we're heading, because you're all constituents, not just of Wentworth. You're all Australian citizens that require the decision-making process.
Well, yeah, it needs to be a referendum to change the constitution. And the only way you get that is you have a vote of parliament to put a referendum out. The Greens are very clear we should move towards a republic. It's a bit odd that this, fairly dysfunctional family on the other side of the planet are our head of state. I can't work that out. You try and explain that to your kids. It's really weird. And it's really weird, and it should end. And we should proudly be a republic where our head of state is one of us, chosen by us.
Personally, I support a move to a republic. However, I think in terms of constitutional business, which this is, I'd focus first on the Uluru Statement of the Heart and the adaptation of that.
If you had been in a coma for the last 2 years and you woke up now and you listen to talk about the Republic and very fast trains and climate change, you'd think you just had a short nap, as though the pandemic and the challenges of the last 2 years and the challenges of the next 10 years never happened. Look, it's an interesting issue. There's lots of interesting things we can talk about, but now is not the time. We face the greatest strategic challenge of our generation right now. And if we're not looking at the Australian economy, Australian jobs, Australian businesses, Australian resilience, geopolitical threats, the potential for war, and we're instead getting distracted by these vanity projects, then we really are not a very smart nation at all. So, you know what? It's an important issue. Now is not the time.
I strongly support becoming a republic. Our constitution's got a few areas that need improvement, like recognition of our First Nation peoples. And our federation is not working so well as the pandemic showed us. So I think tidying all that up and getting ourselves ahead of state. I'm not against the monarchy. They seem like a nice bunch of people, but it's time for us to look after ourselves.
Look, I'm supportive in principle of a republic. It would depend a little upon the model of a president, but I would also take the view that in terms of the importance of constitutional business and referenda, I would prioritise constitutional recognition of our Indigenous peoples, enshrinement of the voice and the Uluru Statement as a higher order of business.
Just to probe you a bit further on that, what do you mean by the method of election of a president?
Well, I think if you have a president who's popularly elected, then they have their own mandate, which means the nature of the office would change. At the moment, the Governor-General in Australia exercises reserve powers only and ceremonial powers by and large. Reserve powers very rarely, ceremonial powers by and large. If you have an elected president that feels they have their own mandate because they've been popularly elected, then because the theoretical powers of the head of state are quite extreme or quite significant, including not enacting legislation that's been passed by both chambers of parliament, you could find that the constitutional balance in our system is disrupted. And I'd be hesitant to do that. I like the idea of an Australian head of state. I don't like the idea of changing the balance of power within the Australian political system.
As I said, we're now going to go to questions from the audience, but it's still organised to some extent. There's some very young people who are going to kick us off. I think it's Mia who's going to ask the first question, and maybe you could explain their yes and no answer questions. Am I right? Okay, away you go.
As a young person, and I know for the electorate of Wentworth, climate action is a crucially important issue and something deciding my parents' and my family's vote. With this in mind, I have a few yes or no questions for you. Yes or no, do you regard the International Energy Agency and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change as two of the foremost expert authorities on climate and energy policies in the world?
Let's get that response first. We'll just go across.
Yes, we do, absolutely.
I'm actually not sure if they're the ultimate authority, so I'm sort of a maybe.
Yes.
Yes.
Also, yes.
If we had better education in this country, people would know what Dorothy Dix actually meant. I think it's very naive to believe that a very complicated question like that can be distilled into a simple black or white answer. So I can't answer such a complex question in a binary form.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Yeah.
Okay, yes or no, can you commit to my generation and the people of Wentworth that if you are elected, you will vote only for evidence-based policy in line with expert opinion and voting against your party's policy if it does not align with expert opinion?
Yes, and I think there's a track record of the Greens Party policy being fundamentally based in evidence.
100%. I'm all about science, being a dentist. I love research, and yes.
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 I'm not going to give you a yes. I think policy should always be informed by expert opinion, but ultimately we don't have rule by experts in Australia. We have rule by elected representatives that need to take into account the consequences of all policies. So certainly always informed by expert opinion and science, but also informed by the human consequences and costs of any policy.
How can Tim Murray honestly say yes to that when voting against a party line is grounds for immediate expulsion from the party?
So was that a yes or a no? Yeah.
Well, look, I'm all about facts, and I'm part of a libertarian party that wouldn't disendorse me for disagreeing with something. So I'm happy with facts and evidence and following facts and evidence. Absolutely.
Okay. Okay, yes or no, are you aware of the International Energy Agency's report published in May last year titled Net Zero by 2050 that unequivocally stated that there is no room in the global carbon budget for any further expansion of fossil fuel projects and called for an immediate halt to any new coal, oil and gas projects?
Yes, and we developed policies for this federal election that implement it to keep coal, oil and gas in the ground. 75% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030 and net zero by 2035. We read it and then we delivered policies to implement it.
Yes, I'm aware of it.
Yes, I am absolutely aware of it, and I don't support any more new coal and gas because I think you have to work with the experts, and this is the International Energy Agency, so I don't support that. And I also stand with both the evidence around 50% reduction, which is what globally we need by 2030, but also what the Business Council of Australia says we can achieve and actually be in our good economic interest by that sort of reduction by 2030.
No.
Yes, I'm aware of the report.
Oh, I read it to my kids every night before bedtime, but if we're serious about things, we need to put in nuclear energy, and that's something we need to be talking about.
Yes or no, if elected, will you support the federal funding of new fossil fuel projects such as the $600 million that's currently being spent on the Kurri Kurri gas plant?
The answer is yes, no. So yes, we would not support any of that funding on fossil fuel projects, and we'd want to pull the funding and the government decision on Kurri Kurri. So yes.
I can't really answer that because I think what we need to look at is energy security and make sure that our entire population has that energy. And if we turn to fossil fuels, to renewables really quickly, then what we'll find is we're going to have the same problems that Germany has at the moment. And we also have to look at, as a nation, to the 30% carbon polluters, China, who, when we are giving them the manufacture of our solar panels and our windmills, we are promoting their pollution. I have to look at everything as it comes.
Sorry, I lost track of the question. In terms of, I do not support any more funding of public money in fossil fuels.
The Labor Party has come out in support of Kurri Kurri on the basis that it transitions to hydrogen.
I'd say that Kurri Kurri it will be a gas peaking plant, which means it's designed to overcome the intermittency of renewables. Our chief scientist, Alan Finkel, has written about this. Gas is a transition fuel, which will get us away from burning coal until we get the large-scale energy storage and pumped hydro you need to operate it. Kurri Kurri is also set up to run on green hydrogen when it's complete and when that's commercially available as a fuel.
If you want to see nation-building projects, as I do, then sometimes that means funding them. And if you're opposed to funding of coal or gas, but you're not opposed to public funding of renewables, which has little to show for it, you're probably in the pocket of renewables investors, and you're not being honest with everyone.
Thank you. Okay, last question from this questioner.
As a young person, I must say, Mr. Sharma, I firstly want to acknowledge your effort to fight for stronger climate targets within the Morrison government. Everyone can believe that you've tried, and that fighting against the Nationals for even the weakest gains can be a thankless task. But the unavoidable truth is that the government that you've been voting with is destroying my life. The climate crisis is here. It's not the future we're talking about anymore. Yep, it's now and it's here. Lismore has been decimated. The whole East Coast has been constantly flooded already this year. And now India is burning. Crops are failing. Yet you're still funding new fossil fuel projects.
Is there a question here?
More than $1 billion were committed in just 1 week of your election campaign. In the face of all expert evidence and reason, you're funding a new gas power station. It's terrifying.
Hey, we're going to have to be careful here because
So instead, you expect us to just read the news and
Hey, can you respect the group by please stopping? Hey, Mia, that you're not. Now, as I explained, okay, well, we didn't get a question, unfortunately. As I explained, if we're going to make statements, I'm going to have to let everyone make a statement. So we have to limit our responses to our interaction to questions and answers by the candidates. It will just get out of control if we don't do that. There are plenty of other opportunities to make statements. This is not the right place. Anyway, here's a question.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for your time today. This week, a report was released from educational economist Alex Norris in relation to federal funding of private and public schools. And it showed that federal funding to private schools has grown up to 5 times the rate of public schools per student. And that all private schools are funded at over 100% of their SRS. Meanwhile, public schools remain 10%, I absolutely are, funded below their minimum SRS funding, a shortfall of $6.5 billion per year. If elected, and I would suggest that that gulf of inequality is no more evident than in Wentworth, if elected, what will you do to ensure that that gulf of inequality of funding is reversed?
We'll start with Allegra.
So I've spent the last, I think people should have educational choice, and we have wonderful educational choice in the private sector in Wentworth, but very limited in the public sector, except we have it in primary, we definitely don't have it in secondary. I support that. I've spent the last 4 years working in public education, and I support that we have a needs-based funding system for education, and that's what it is. So I support the acceleration of the uptake of the Gonski review, so that we ensure that where we fund is where students need it most.
The Labor Party recognises that disparity, and we will be aiming to move the spending back towards public schools. I think one of the key issues is funding for capital works that has not been coming from the federal government. Labor will increase that funding, but frankly, it's a drop in the ocean, and we need to move more in that direction.
Look, I'm the product of a non-selective public high school education myself, and I'm thankful for the opportunities that gave me. And I believe that other children should have the same opportunities, regardless of the wealth of your family or the income of your family. You should be able to get a decent education and the social mobility that provides. Here in Wentworth, I don't think there is good enough choice for parents, particularly in the public sector system. I've worked very closely with Sarah Mitchell, who's the New South Wales Minister for Education, Rob Stokes before her, firstly to expand the catchment area of Inner Sydney High School to make sure that there's more public high school places available to the east. Now I'm working with Sarah to try and make sure that Randwick Boys and Randwick Girls High Schools are upgraded so they're a more attractive choice for parents, and to reduce the amount of out-of-area enrolments for Rose-based secondary, so there's more choices there. I'm not aware of the report that you referred to, but I'm happy to take a look at it.
We'll go to Daniel.
If you visit my website, voteluco.org, it'll link you to the Freedom Manifesto and our education policy. And it's important to have clearly articulated policies, not just sort of hope and change and slogans. This ties back to Mia's comments earlier. Mia, I'm really sorry that you're so upset and you're so angry and that you think your life has been ruined. I have to tell you something. This is an amazing nation. You have a life expectancy that dwarfs that of everyone who went before you. You have access to the entire body of human knowledge literally in your pocket right now. But the problem is, because of our education system, she hasn't learned some of these things. And we need to look at improving our educational standards. More billions of dollars is not going to solve the problem.
Members of the panel to make personal comments on questioners. We can do without that. So we're up to...
Something's deeply wrong with our national policy on education when private schools are building their second performing arts centre or knocking down and rebuilding their Olympic pool when our public schools aren't air conditioned. They've thousands of demountables. It's just plain wrong.
But how does the politics of envy mean we can sack terrible teachers? Right now, we can't sack incompetent
So if you're
teachers.
going to a public school in Brewarrina or Southwest Sydney, you should have the same right to facilities and support from the federal government as if you're going to a public school or a private school in Wentworth, and it doesn't happen. And the reason is because under both Labor and the coalition policy, but worse under the coalition policy, no capital funding goes to public schools. No federal capital funding goes to public schools. So when Mr. Sharma stands up here and says he wants to see improved facilities in public schools, his government won't put $1 there because they have a policy of only having capital funding to state schools come from stretched state budgets. It's wrong. We need to fix it. We need to fund on the basis of need.
When I went to high school, we had a lot more public high schools in this area. We had Dover Heights, which is now Rose Bay. We had Vaucluse High, and I ended up going to Sydney Girls. I was lucky enough to actually get into that. Now, my daughter has had to go to a private high school only because she is a dancer and she's not academic. She's very right-brained, and there's no high schools that offer that particular subject in this area. Yes, absolutely. We should never have closed the existing high schools we had in the first place. We need education, and the most important thing in any society is the education of our young. We're not looking at that enough. So we really need to bring that back, educating our young in so many ways.
Yeah, there's a question here. And can I just again remind you that we need questions and not long preambles? Thank you.
Hi, so my question requires a very short preamble. I just wanted to, it's a question about the number one issue for this electorate. I'm a local resident, around climate change. And the preamble is, I do want to, before I ask this question, say thank you to the members of the fossil fuel and coal communities who have worked for hundreds of years, especially over the last 50 years, and with which we have built this amazing city. I thank you for your incredible service. Here's my question. Which position do you support? Position A, that we see the transition to sustainability as a massive multi-trillion-dollar opportunity, and that Australia can be a world leader in this transition to sustainable zero carbon and circular economies, or B, that we should be a very slow follower, that we should maintain our position as a leading exporter of carbon and fossil fuels in the world. So A or B, thank you.
Start with you, Tim.
So I'm going to say A. Thank you.
I say A.
Look, also, I think there's a huge, immense economic opportunity for Australia in this transition. And this is why we're investing money in things like green hydrogen hubs in places like Townsville and Gladstone, in technologies like low emission steel and low emissions aluminium. 50 years ago, the biggest export earners for Australia were wool and wheat. Today, they're coal, iron ore, and natural gas, education a fourth. I have no doubt that in 20 or 30 years, and hopefully sooner, our biggest exporters will be things like hydrogen, low emission steel, low emissions aluminium, carbon-free cement, those sorts of things.
Well, Australia could be a world leader in nuclear energy, but that wouldn't make billions of dollars for Simon Holmes à Court and other renewables investors. So nuclear gets treated like the N word that we're not allowed to say. And I think that's going to mean the lights go out, and it's going to make us a really stupid nation.
Okay. Yeah, so we support the first option, but then not only do we say it, we actually have policies that will make us deliver that. And I think that's what's at stake in this election. You can take the hollow word, or you can actually look at the policies. Are they going to underpin it? Are they going to deliver it? Is it something you can be hopeful about?
There's no argument at all that we want zero emissions. I don't think that's even remotely an argument by anybody. I actually support nuclear energy because of the efficiency. One golf ball size of uranium or thorium can provide your energy levels for the rest of your life, just for one person. We also have a really good recycling program. You can use any of the recyclables and to create more energy. So on this one, I'm with Daniel, but yes, zero, definitely A, zero.
We're going to go to the very back this time. There's someone from the back blocks. Here's a young questioner. Make it a question, please.
So the Murray-Darling, I think like 2 trillion litres of water have gone missing from it due to water theft. Do you have any policy or plan to basically stop this water theft?
Very good question. We'll start with you, Natalie.
We actually don't have a policy on that, but theft of water is not very good. I think we've now been selling China, our water to China, so we're going to stop doing that. We will definitely look at it if elected, but I think it's a second tier problem. We have economic problems that are far superior, and we really need to look at those so that we don't end up losing homes and other things that are going on right now.
Look, it's an enormous concern, and I think it's a concern for many people. And this is an example, I think, where it's not just the Murray-Darling. It's how we consider and work in our environment in this country. And I think the concern that we haven't implemented, for instance, the Samuel Review, which is about it's about protecting our environment. That the government at the moment has Tony Abbott's climate targets and the impact that has on our environment. These are some of the things that mean that we are not working with our environment. So it's about the Murray-Darling Basin, but it's absolutely much broader than that. And that's why I'm standing as an independent, because I want to change that.
Thanks for the question. It's a very good one. The Labor Party has a very clear policy it's a 5-point policy. I can't remember all the details, but it's bringing back the Water Commission and putting money behind sorting out that water. I will find that policy for you and give it to you at the end of the forum.
We'll go to Daniel.
Australia's always had wet seasons and dry seasons, a land of droughts and flooding rains. And if you look at all the water that fell in the last few months, and all of that went down the drain, and yet if we look at nation building projects like building a dam, you'll always have the Greens find a rare tree frog that means those projects never happen, which means a few years later when there's a dry season, instead of having water that we can rely upon, we hear that it's climate change, and that's just silly. We could do better things with our water, and that includes building dams and harvesting it rather than wasting money on desalination plants or just letting it go down the drain or out to sea.
Thank you.
Look, absolutely, water theft from the Murray-Darling River system should be stopped. It was the Howard government that created the Murray-Darling Basin Authority, which was designed to overcome some of the state rivalries or parochial state interests, which were hurting the health of that river system. So absolutely, we should stop water theft, and we should make sure that irrigators do not take more water than they're entitled to, or that would compromise the health of the Murray-Darling River system.
We've got a questioner over here. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yep. Look, it's a terrific question, and I'm very glad you came because, yes, we've had dry seasons and wet seasons in Australia, but it's only in the last 2 decades we've had thousands of gigalitres being held by big corporate cotton irrigators, preventing that water coming into our rivers and seeing the fish kills and the scale of the fish kills. Twice now, I have voted in the New South Wales Parliament to strike down coalition regulations supported by state and federal that would have legitimised the theft of thousands and thousands and thousands of gigalitres in storage in New South Wales. Which would have destroyed the future of our rivers. Yes, we need evidence-based. I think Tim putting forward the concept of an independent commission, which will have evidence-based set of policies for water in New South Wales and the country, is absolutely critical. But it does start with recognising we can't put those thousands and thousands of gigalitres in big corporate cotton farms and expect the river to flow. We need to address that.
We've got a question here.
How would you address improving the functionality of the NDIS? And would you consider perhaps a separate tax to fund it?
Great question. We'll start with Dave.
Look, to begin with, I think the NDIS is an important social policy reform, and credit to the Rudd-Gillard governments for instituting it out or in legislating for it and introducing it. The NDIS has still got challenges. I mean, the growth and the uptake of the NDIS has been massive, much bigger than we predicted, much bigger than anyone predicted at the time. There's about 500,000 Australians that are benefiting from the NDIS now, but it is an expensive program, and it's about, in the order of $15 to $20 billion that we've allocated in the budget per year over the forward estimates, which means it's soon going to start rivaling Medicare as a cost on the budget. And one of Tim's colleagues, Andrew Charlton, who's the Labor candidate in Parramatta, has written about the cost of it. In terms of long-term funding for it, look, I would be open to that particular idea, but I generally speaking think we should fund government programs out of general tax revenue, not hypothecated levies and things like that. Yes, we do have a special Medicare levy, but I generally think we should be looking to fund them out of government programs. But it's an important social reform. We do need to try and make sure we control costs without compromising the needs of people with disabilities. And how we do that will depend very much on a case-by-case basis, I think.
It's a very complex issue, and I don't know all the details. I do know that from speaking with people with disability and interfacing with the current way the NDIS is managed is that there's not enough money put into the administration of the scheme, and that there's not enough ways to review outcomes when your plan has been changed. And Labor Party is committed to changing those things. On the funding of it, it is a massive, massive endeavour by government, and I think it should not be discounted, the idea of having a separate tax as we've had in the past for Medicare.
Look, I've also spoken to a lot of people in Wentworth and talk about the value that the NDIS has added to their lives, and the importance. Someone actually bailed me up in the street yesterday and asked me about that. And I think the issues that people are talking to me about in relation to the NDIS is really about how to make sure that the people and the family are at the centre of the services, and that the services are easy to access and easy to understand. And you have people now whose job is just to help people wade through the NDIS. That level of complexity just doesn't work for Australian families, and is actually poor government services if it's really that complex. So I believe that we should be looking at reviewing the NDIS in terms of how to make it more centric to families and make it easier for families to come in and come out of the NDIS, so that, for instance, if your child you feel can step down their care, you're not worried that if you need to step up their care, you're never going to get that again. So those are some of the things that I think are most important.
That's definitely a good question. I think NDIS is an incredibly important thing, but we do have to have some sort of funding, and it has to come from somewhere. So this is where we look at the 15% tariff on iron ore to try and pay down a $1.3 trillion debt. So we can put some sort of funding into this infrastructure and really support it. And I agree with Allegra. The majority of our government's websites and the way we apply to things are bureaucratically impossible to maneuver. Whether it be Service New South Wales, it does not matter. They're literally impossible. We need to make it easier for people, especially the elderly, who really don't have a lot of access to internet. And if they do, they don't know how to maneuver it. So we need to simplify things.
Yeah, look, the NDIS is critical nation building reform and of justice and equity. And it goes to show what you can get with a minority government delivered through the Rudd-Gillard government. That's what you can get. I think we need a collective commitment from across politics. And I hope you're hearing a bit of that here. I mean, a lot of disagreement. I hope we're hearing a bit of that here to agree to funding the NDIS. But we've seen attacks on NDIS funding from the current government, which was seen off by a majority in the Senate, thankfully, we voted against them. But yes, I think we need a sustainable funding for the NDIS, whether that's in a hypothecated individual tax, we don't have a policy on, but I do agree it should be core work from general revenue and the general tax revenue that we have.
Daniel?
Well, my company, my security business is actually a major employer of people with disabilities. So this is something I have a particular knowledge of. And I've also professionally been an expert witness for the NDIS in respect to some serious fraud that goes on in there. Now, one of the problems is whenever a government creates a huge trough of cash, all of the pigs get their snouts in that trough. So if we're talking about, say, Rudd-Gillard government, the pink bats and school halls would be a great example of that. There is a huge, huge amount of waste in the NDIS. There's also a huge amount of fraud, and the insiders to the NDIS are aware of that. I mean, some of the examples, middle-aged women who 5 minutes ago got a diagnosis of ADD and are now paying for professional organisers to come around and make their pantries Instagrammable. I mean, these sort of things happen, and the problem is that that's hurting people with legitimate disabilities. The challenge is, though, that if a government says we're going to get rid of $50 million, all of a sudden you'll have all the lovies saying, no, they're going to hurt disabled kids. What we need is much more efficiency in government, and that's how you solve problems and lower taxes.
Thank you. I've just got there's a question, we've got quite a lot of questions submitted ahead of time. It hasn't come up yet, so I thought I might ask it. And it's about preferences. Could all the candidates please advise which party you will be preferencing in your how to vote material?
Well, the first thing is, since the reforms that were driven by a former Greens colleague, Lee Rhiannon, in the Senate, in the last few years, now in both the Senate and lower house, you get to direct your own preferences. It's no longer a cooked up political hatchet job in the Senate. You have to number, and if you want the vote to be valid in the Senate, vote 1 to 6 above the line at least. And downstairs, you also get to direct your own preferences. We will be recommending preferences in this election: 1 Green, 2 Independent, Allegra, 3 to Labor, 4 to the Coalition, and then to the rest of the sort of right wingers after that.
You guys actually get to preference whoever you like. You can follow our recommendation or not follow our recommendation. It's really up to the voter. I'm getting to that. The United Australia Party is preferencing Daniel Lukowitz as the Liberal Democrat, followed by, I'm not sure, because the party gets to decide. So I haven't got the ballot just yet, but we will be telling you exactly our recommendations. But I think that each and every one of you has the right to decide who you preference.
So just to clarify, you haven't chosen preferences beyond a second preference?
We have, but I'm not at liberty to say just yet.
When will you be?
It's coming in this week. So I will get back to you and I will tell you all by next week.
Well, why wouldn't you be able to tell the voters now if it's already been decided?
Because the decision was actually made by the United Australia Party.
Okay.
I'm not saying people make up your own minds. And I'm saying that because the people who are supporting me are a broad church of people. We've got people who are, traditional Liberal people, traditional Labor people, Greens, and a variety of people who are just looking for change and who are saying the most important thing for them is to have an independent voice in Wentworth. And so I'm really saying, look, make up your own minds after that. I'm really clear on what I'm standing for, particularly climate and integrity.
So you won't be having how to vote cards?
I will. Sorry. I'm going to have a how to vote card, but it's going to have little question marks in all the boxes so people can make up their own minds.
Hang on. Have you just encouraged Australians to vote informally?
No, it's really clear that you have to number every box. I'm just saying that they get to make up their own mind.
So our how to vote goes 1 Labor, 2 Greens, 3 Allegra Spender, 4 Dave Sharma, and to be honest, I can't remember the other 3, but choose whatever you like with those 3. I would like to say, I made a request to the head office to put Allegra at number 2, and they put Greens at number 2 before Allegra. And I asked that because I've asked members of the Labor Party and people in the public what they wanted on our cards, and that's why we've chosen that way.
Daniel, we'll hear from you.
Yeah, look, I didn't know Lee Rhiannon was responsible for changing how to vote cards work.
What are your preferences, please?
Well, I think there's actually 2 issues, and I will address that. But the how to vote cards can be ignored. What needs to be addressed, and I think some of the candidates have dodged this, is who would you give supply to, and who would you align yourself with in Parliament? Because that's what really matters.
Daniel, can you just say who you're preferencing?
Look, that's fine. I can tell you from bottom to top, we have a national agreement that we will put the Greens last in every seat at every election, and they can get stuffed. So that's a tradition we're maintaining. My views are generally toward lower taxes and smaller governments. So we would be preferencing Natalie at number 2. That's part of a national agreement. The Liberal will be the next option. That's followed by minor parties. Dean Fisher, don't worry, Dave, don't take notes. I'll send you this later, mate. Tim Murray, and then Allegra Spender, the Greens. So the Labor, Greens and Independent Alliance will be at the bottom.
Thank you very much. Dave.
Look, I have got a how to vote card. It's on, I think it's on my website now, and it's on the Liberal Party website as well. From recollection, it's myself, then Daniel, then Natalie, then Allegra, then Tim, then the Greens, then One Nation, I think. But I just make the point. Firstly,
I can't hear the heckling, by the way. Can someone translate for me?
I don't know what the heckling is about, Daniel. Look, how to vote card is a recommendation. Voters should feel free entirely to ignore that as they wish, as long as they number every box so their votes are valid. Secondly, the truth is in this seat, the candidates that finish first and second, their preferences are not distributed. This is an academic exercise. And the more important point, honestly, is, as Daniel raised, which candidate or which party are you going to support to form government? And I'll be supporting a Liberal government and Scott Morrison as the Prime Minister.
I'm afraid this is going to be the last question because we're running out of time. A woman there with, yeah. You do.
I can't hear.
Don't worry, Daniel, I've got you. I run a local domestic and family violence service in Wentworth. And the one thing I haven't heard today is anything about domestic and family violence and abuse. It's a huge issue in this area. And if anybody in this room thinks it's not, you are absolutely kidding yourselves. I would like to know how each candidate intends to support the local services that provide support for women and children escaping domestic and family abuse.
Great question. We're very close to time, so everyone's literally going to have 30 seconds to answer.
That you're dead right. It's not just an issue in Wentworth, it's an issue around the country. The Greens, I haven't got the exact figures. We have policy to have significant increase in federal funding for domestic violence and also for full accommodation. One of the real issues is women fleeing domestic violence, running from domestic violence, haven't got safe accommodation. That requires an urgent national investment in housing and first priority being given to people fleeing domestic violence.
We don't have a policy to that, but this is a topic that's close to my heart because I was a victim of that. So I totally understand. And I think we really need to look at that because people who are in domestic violence situations, their self-esteem is decimated and it takes years to build that up again. So I am totally with you on that one.
I'll be advocating to prioritisation of domestic violence funding into grassroots areas because I think that is really clear from a variety of reviews that it's actually that local support in domestic violence. It makes the greatest difference. It's also support before someone has actually left a domestic violence situation because it's that preparation that is absolutely vital to a safe departure, and that's what I'll be doing.
Well, my company has provided a fortune of pro bono assistance to domestic violence charities and safe houses, including in Wentworth, and that's something I'm very proud of. So I have put my money where my mouth is. It's not platitudes and empty statements. It's something that I understand, and that is helping people at risk. It's something I've literally done my entire career and something I continue to want to do.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that domestic violence is a serious issue in Wentworth. It's not just a wealthy place, it's also a place of a very high level of domestic violence. Speak with any police person because they're the ones who have to deal with it first. The Labor Party has had a great policy in this area. We'll be putting 1.6 billion in to build 4,000 new social housing properties and 100 million into crisis accommodation, employing another 500 new community sector workers, and making sure there's 10 days of paid leave for people escaping domestic violence. At the last election, they're also offering $10,000 straight up to somebody fleeing violence because often it's been financial violence. I'm not sure if that's still in our policy, but I'll check and get back to you.
Look, it's a very good question, and people would know if you speak to the police here in the eastern suburbs or many of the outfits that work on domestic violence, people will know it's a much underreported and misunderstood problem here in the eastern suburbs. And it's not just domestic violence; it's also abusive relationships, coercive control, any number of things that men in particular use against female partners to keep them in relationships where they're deeply unhappy and intimidated and bullied. We're developing the national plan to eliminate violence against women and children. We've got about $1.3 billion invested over the forward estimates in the budget to invest in local domestic violence organisations, but also a national framework. And one of the initiatives of the last year of government that I've been most pleased with is the escaping violence payment, a one-off payment that's available to people fleeing abusive relationships to help them escape and leave, because the experience of many people who leave abusive relationships is they take several attempts at least to leave, and it's because they don't have the support of local organisations and financial support to be able to do that. We've just expanded significantly that escaping violence payment, and I think it's an important step forward.
Thank you. I'm very sorry, this is going to be the last part of today's event. All the candidates have 60 seconds to tell you why you should vote for them. We'll do it in the same order as the draw. So first is David.
To put the figures, on domestic violence, we'll be putting $12 billion in domestic violence support over the next decade, and the $10,000 grants that are payable so people can, particularly women can flee domestic violence. It's a fully costed policy. I'll share it with you after this. But look, this is a critical election, as I said, an absolutely critical election. In just 3 weeks' time, we can choose whether to go down the same path that the Coalition and Labor wanted, that the Coalition has wanted to take us down over the last 8 years, or we can choose a hopeful future, a hopeful economy based on renewable energy rather than coal, a hopeful society where people in desperate need get the services that they deserve. Or we can choose another 3 years of Scott Morrison. So I can tell you now, the Greens are very clear. We want to wake up in 21 days' time on the 22nd of May and be able to say on that Sunday morning, former Prime Minister Scott Morrison, because most of the changes we want start at that point. But we also want to make sure that we don't just hand a blank check to Labor, that we have a powerful crossbench, a progressive crossbench made up of independents and Greens that can hold the next Labor government to account and deliver on the kind of promises you've seen here. Because I have to tell you, that's how we got an ICAC in New South Wales. That's how we get fundamental reform. We need to have a parliament that doesn't just work for one major party. We need a parliament that works for people and the planet. Thanks very much.
My background is that of being a migrant coming from Odessa, Ukraine, former USSR. The stories my parents have told me makes me wary of government overreach. And boy, have we had government overreach over the last 2 years. It's time to look at solution-based policy to what we have created. I'm wary when a government takes away our freedoms temporarily, as even temporarily sets a precedent for our future. We just celebrated Anzac Day for the first time since 2019. Our veterans and Anzacs fought under the Australian flag for the freedoms to work and put food on our table, travel and see our loved ones, and the ability to frequent a place of worship like this one. These are freedoms our society is based on. They should be honoured. Oh, hello. They should be honoured and revered every year. Lest we forget, but we have forgotten, that these freedoms are fought for with the incredibly high price tag of human life, but are so easily given away by our present day society. We here are the generations who can make a difference to the present, and I hope you will join me in doing exactly that, providing Wentworth and Australia with real, genuine policies, solutions, and real freedoms. I was going to pat him, but you know.
Come on, John. You can do better.
I think the dog is seeking asylum in the church. Is that still a thing?
Daniel, your turn.
Well, a few minutes ago, Allegra said that there's only 2 people who can possibly win this. So I wonder why the rest of us got out of bed early. But I think that also speaks to a tremendous and disappointing sense of entitlement that a person with no relevant background other than millions and billions of funding behind them can just win an election. And I don't think that's good for our democracy. I think Australians deserve talent. They deserve clearly articulated policies. They deserve experienced leadership, and they need to know what they're getting and not just lining the pockets of the people bankrolling them. I'm committed to better government in this country. I'm committed to taking this nation forward. I want to see freedoms restored that should have never been taken away. I want to see less government so that Australians are free to live their lives the way they choose. I want to see lower taxes. I want to see better education, and I invite everybody to visit my website, see what we are really about, learn about minor parties, and don't be conned by major parties or people pretending that they're not part of a party when they're part of a very well-funded, orchestrated campaign. I want to take this nation forward, and I ask for your support in helping me achieve that.
The people of Wentworth want action on climate change. I want more than just action on climate change. I want to change the nation so that it can never be taken away from us again. I believe a Labor government can bring our nation together and bed down climate action for our future. And that's why I'd like you to vote for me, so that I can be part of a Labor government that will do that.
Thank you. Look, I know what this community stands for because I've spent a long time talking to you. And you say you want strong climate action. You want politics to reflect the best of you, not the worst of you. And we want good environment for business. And finally, we want a kind and compassionate society. These are the values of this community. And as an independent, I will stand up and vote every single time on what are the issues that are important to this community. If the Nationals, if Matt Canavan, if Barnaby Joyce are putting forward climate wrecking policies, I will vote against them because that's my commitment to the community. If there's pork barreling, if there's a waste of government money and there's an opportunity to bring in a federal ICAC, I will vote for a federal ICAC because that is what this community tells me day in, day out they want. If there are policies ahead that are about building things that are good for business, to make running businesses easier so that our young people can prosper, I will be voting for them because that's what you want as your community. And if there are policies around refugees and about the fair treatment of the most vulnerable people in our society, I will be voting for them because that's what this community wants. I'll be standing on what this community wants, and I will be voting, I will be putting forward legislation, and I'll be advocating for this community every single time, not a party. Thank you.
This is a very important election, and my message to you is that your vote is a precious thing and you should exercise it wisely. Think about what sort of a government you want over the next 3 years. Don't use your vote as a protest exercise. Think about what sort of country you want as for the next 3 years. I'd say to you, if you've got candidates or parties who are not addressing the full suite of challenges that Australia faces, from a climate of global economic uncertainty and national security challenges, then don't vote for that uncertainty. If you've got a candidate who's offering you slogans but not detailed policies or costings or any plan for how you'll get these things done in Parliament, then don't vote for that uncertainty. If you've got candidates who will not tell you the most important thing, how they will vote on the most important issue they're likely to face in the event that they're elected and there's a hung Parliament, who will they support to form the government? Which candidate will they support to be Prime Minister? Then don't vote for that uncertainty. You know who I am. You know my track record. You know how I've stood up for this community, and I'll continue to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming. There's actually apparently the hall is booked at 12 and it's right on 12 now. So could I encourage you to move out? Thank you very much for coming, and thanks to the candidates.
Thank you. Thank you, Matt, for helping us steer through a lot of really complicated issues. Thank you to our ballet instructor who's being very patient. If you would like to help pack chairs up from the hall, parishioners have provided some coffee, tea and biscuits. If you'd like to continue to talk in this room, that would be okay. So thank you all for investing in democracy and for coming out to inform your vote. Thank you.